Both the Atari Jaguar and the Sega Saturn are some of the most underrated video game consoles of all time, and they both share a very similar story, because the fate of what happened to both of these consoles are pretty much the same. They're both really great game systems with a lot of great exclusive games on them, but most people didn't get to play them back in the day, and it really wasn't their fault, honestly. For the most part, it wasn't their fault. We are now learning more about in and outs and the secrets of what went wrong with the Sega Saturn and the Atari Jaguar, where in the past we put all this blame, this heavy blame on both the individual decisions of both companies. But the biggest reason why the Sega Saturn and the Atari Jaguar failed was because of these fucking electronic game stores at the time. Now, this is before GameStop, so we gotta go in the Wayback Machine to the 1990s, where Toys R Us and KB Toys and these other kind of stores, they were the kings, okay? These were the stores, really, where it was the first time we got to be exposed to these video game consoles, and we were kids, and we'd go into these stores, and that's how we found out about them, really, because this was before the internet, so you might see it in a magazine, maybe, or when you go in Toys R Us, you're like, wow, okay, here's the new game system by this company or that company. Here's the problem, guys. Back in the day, during the Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis era, Toys R Us, for example, and all of them, really, where Sega sold the Genesis and stuff, they forced Sega to keep a massive amount of stock of their games in their warehouse, just in case the customers demanded more Sega hardware and games. But what happened was, and that was amazing at first, thanks to Tom Kalinske, and Tom said he worked out deals with these stores, but they were assholes. The people that own these Toys R Us's and KB Toys, they forced Tom to do this to the company, to make sure you have bajillions of stock, just in case. But what happened was, as time went on, people were asking less of this game and that game and that game, say a Game Gear title, a Genesis title, whatever. They were asking less of them as time went on, because now time has gone on, so, things are always changing. So games they get less popular as time go on. A game that sold really, really well in 1991 and 1992, it doesn't sell as well in 1994 and 1995. So that's just a natural thing in video gamers, and that's perfectly okay. But it wasn't okay to these fucking toy stores and electronic stores. And they forced them to do this. They forced Sega to do this. They forced Atari to do this. They forced the company that made the 3DO to do this. They forced all these other game companies, TurboGrafx, they forced all of them to do this shit. And that's why it was hard for us to be exposed to the 3DO. The 3DO sucked, by the way, but, all these consoles, the Sega Saturn, Jaguar, that's why they struggled so badly. And it wasn't because the games were not good. They had great games. It wasn't that. It was the toy stores. And they didn't do this to Nintendo. Why? Because Nintendo, they made the NES in the 1980s, and they dominated the 1980s. Because they made all these exclusive deals with the third-party companies like Capcom and Konami, and they were very strict with their rules, and they sold the NES as a children's toy. So they were very clever in how they presented their toy, quote-unquote, to Toys R Us and all these other toy stores and electronic stores. So the NES took off because the games were great and people were getting into it, and Mario became a star. Nintendo was a kid-friendly company. The way they did that was brilliant, but it screwed all the other competition. And I feel bad for Sega as a game company, because even if they wanted to be the nice guys and be like, hey, we want a new Sega Genesis system and we can coexist with Nintendo, we can both own the market, right? Even if they wanted to be nice, Nintendo forced them to be mean about it. That's why they had to make those ads of Genesis does what Nintendo don't. They had no choice, Sega. They had to be ruthless towards Nintendo because Nintendo had such a tight, unfair, unreasonable grip on the video games market. Nintendo acted like they owned video games. They did not. And they acted like they did. And that changed with the Genesis because of how aggressive they were. So I give all the props in the world to Sega as a game company. Their story as a game company, as a console manufacturer, they were the underdogs, Sega. And they always were, even back in the day. Yes, like the Genesis and the Super Nintendo were neck and neck, but man, they were always the underdogs, though. So these toy stores and electronic stores back in the day, they had different rules for Nintendo, where they didn't have to have millions or thousands of copies of their games and consoles in stock. Oh, but Sega and Atari and all these other game companies were forced to do that. So that's why Sega was hemorrhaging money so badly. Most of the reasons why the Sega Saturn and the Atari Jaguar failed were because of these stores. There were little decisions that Sega made and the Jaguar and Atari made that didn't help their cause. That there were mistakes. There were like minor mistakes. But these minor mistakes, like the launch for the Sega Saturn, that was a minor mistake. That wasn't a huge blunder. It shouldn't have been like the companies that were pissed. I don't understand like this story people always present. Oh, Sega failed the launch of the Sega Saturn, and all these toy stores weren't in on the loop, so KB Toys refused to sell the Sega Saturn. Well, fuck them. Those people were assholes. All they needed to do was call up Sega and say, "Hey, you have Sega Saturn? We want to sell your Sega Saturn." Sega's like, "Okay." They shipped the Sega Saturn to the toy store. That's fine. Why did they have to know beforehand? Out of the loop. They didn't have to be part of the loop. It would have been nice, but did they have to do that? And then like KB Toys was like, "Oh, we refuse to sell the Sega Saturn." God, I mean, these stores were such assholes. The people that ran them, they ran Sega and the other companies into the ground because Nintendo had this reputation that they were video games. I mean, this is such a bullshit. That all the blame for Sega's demise and the Saturn's demise was all on Sega themselves? No, it was these stores. We were fed lies about this because we're so nostalgic. When we were kids, Toys R Us, KB Toys, these kind of stores, that's all they were to us. They were like palaces. So we went in there and we were like, "Oh, wow, look at the games, look at the toys." That's why, we don't view, especially as kids, we didn't view the business side of these stores, which were full of corrupt, rude, cold-hearted, bullshit, obnoxious people. And what's funny about this is that these stores were the reason for the demise of Sega and Atari, but at the end of the day, they lost also, because Toys R Us and KB Toys went out of business. So they lost also. And it was all because of their corrupt fucking business practices. We all remember how it was in the 2010s where toys became less popular, the culture was changing, new kids arriving, toys are not as popular, we're entering a digital age or whatever the fuck. Yeah, blah, blah, blah. So Toys R Us should have sold their toys for less money. But what did they do? They decided, well, we don't care. And I remember working at Toys R Us in the 2010s, and everything was overpriced. Then it led to their demise. Yeah, that's what you get. That's what you get, motherfuckers. You get what you deserve. So they were corrupt back then, overpricing everything in the 90s, and then they just kept pricing everything the same price, or higher, in the 2010s. And then it's like, no wonder they went out of business. And these kind of practices screwed over the Sega Saturn and the Atari Jaguar, guys. Now, there were two blunders the Atari Jaguar had that was Atari's fault. The first blunder is that they should have fixed the bugs that were in the software that they built the Jaguar in. They had a lot of bugs they needed to fix, and the programmers told Atari, "Hey, we need to fix these bugs so that people can make the games easier for the Jag." Atari was like, the president or whatever was like, "Fuck you guys. No, it's got to be out by Christmas '93." And that was a mistake. That was a mistake. I can't blame them for being excited. I loved the Atari Jaguar, and they did have the Jaguar on some British video game shows back in the day where they showed off Cybermorph in late 1993. Okay, so just show it off. Show people what's coming early 1994. You couldn't just show it? Did you have to have it out now? They needed bugs to be fixed. So show it off, late 93. The Jag should have had their bugs fixed so that people can make games easier for the console. And the games would have been easier to make and better, too. Then the Atari Jaguar could have launched early 1994 or mid-1994, and it would have been way better. So that was Atari's mistake. But at the same time, IBM was making the chips or something like that for the Jaguar. They did not know how to properly manufacture a game console because they were used to computers. And Atari had overconfidence in them, and it backfired. Now look, they fucked up, IBM. So that was not Atari's fault, that was IBM's fault. But when that happened, I don't know why Atari didn't have a backup plan just in case IBM didn't work out. They were so confident in them that they were like, oh, IBM's going to just do it all and we have no issue. Immediately, right away, as soon as they heard IBM is having problems getting the console out there, then they should have hired another game company to make the hardware, to release it, like right the fuck away. And so that was IBM's mistake, but it was also Atari's mistake. They should have had a backup plan. They should have looked at 2 or 3 companies just in case one of them wasn't able to do it, you know. And then, because they knew that already, and if that happened, then by mid-94, there would have been plenty of Jaguar consoles in stock for them to send out to the stores, okay? Because I read some article or something that said there was actually a high demand for Atari Jaguar in 1994, believe it or not. And 1993. There was this demand of 2 million consoles from these stores, the customers. They kept asking for the Jaguar, and then they would call up Atari, and Atari would say, hey, we don't have any more. That's why there was such little access to owning a Jaguar back in the day, because of the IBM issue. So if Atari had more Jaguar systems to sell with all this demand, the Jaguar could have made 2 million, could have sold 2 million consoles, the games would have sold more, fixing the bugs, and when you think about it that way, 1994, 1995, the Jag could have sold 4 or 5 million consoles, and then that would not have been a failure, and it could have even sold more than 5 million, because the Jaguar was a very powerful game system. And it had its era in 1994. It did have games on it that were worthy of a great game console. Alien vs. Predator, Doom, iWar, Iron Soldier, Hover Strike. But just think about it. Even if Atari didn't solve those 2 issues themselves with IBM and the bugs of the Jaguar, if the toy stores weren't assholes, then the Jaguars would have still sold more. They still would have sold more. So really, for the most part, it was the store's fault that the Sega Saturn and the Atari Jaguar failed. For the most part, it was their fault. And it wasn't right. Nintendo did not own video games. They weren't the creators of video games. They made video games popular, but, I mean, again, they used to be popular when the Atari 2600 first launched. But people back then, in the late 70s and stuff, they thought video games were a fad. So, you know, it's just not fair. The kind of big blaming we do. Oh, it was Tom Kalinski's fault from Sega of America. No, Tom Kalinski was a hero to Sega. If it wasn't for Tom, Sega would not have been this powerhouse it was in the early 90s. And it was Tom's decision to pack in Sonic the Hedgehog with the Sega Genesis game console. The heads of Sega in Japan were pissed off at Tom for that, but they bended and said, okay, if you think it's going to work, then do it. It was Tom that was the reason for Sega's success as a game company. It was not Tom's fault that the assholes that owned these toy stores had all these really unreasonable requests and demands from these game companies. And here's the thing. So, what about the Sony PlayStation, the PS1? Did they have this manufacturing problem? Did they demand this from Sony? I doubt it. And this is my theory as to why Sony didn't have this issue that Sega and Atari had. I think they had different quota for Sony. Why? Because Sony, before they made the PS1, they were known as an electronic company. They sold headphones, CD players, TV sets. They were known to sell electronics to these electronic stores. It was different. All these stores, they had a relationship with Sony, dating a long time. So they had different rules for Sony than they did for Sega and for Atari, okay? And especially the stores didn't trust Atari because people looked back at the time and they were like, oh, Atari was the reason for the crash of 1983, which is debatable. But that's how people viewed Atari. But they still should have had more of a chance when they said they were coming back to make a console. Like, guys, all these companies that were the presidents of these toy stores and stuff, they needed to realize this isn't just Nintendo World. This isn't just Nintendo is video games. No, everybody gets to play the ball. Everybody gets to have the ball. It's not like Sega and Atari and all these other game companies, the TurboGrafx, 3DO. It's not like they deserve to just get the little crumbs, and Nintendo just gets the whole fucking pie. That's not right. No. All these other pieces of industry get to have competition, get to have the same rules and the same regulations that everyone in the competition they have gets to have. So why was it different for video games? It was bullshit. It was bullshit, and we need to stop putting 100% of the blame on the actual companies themselves that made the consoles. Most of the motherfucking blame goes to these motherfucking stores. And it's like the reason why we haven't realized it all these years is because we were kids back then. So we didn't see it from a business point of view. We always kept thinking of the companies that made the consoles. Oh, they had better games, that's why it sold more. Wasn't the games. No. The Saturn had a lot of great exclusive games. So did the Jaguar. Wasn't the games. Yeah, you can argue the PS1 and the N64 are better game systems. And yeah, sure. But the PS1 and the N64 had more of a shot to sell games because they had different deals with these toy stores. So people were more exposed to the PS1 and the N64, where all these other stores, they didn't want to promote the Sega Saturn and the Jaguar. And this whole like bitterness they had towards Sega. Oh, you didn't let us in on the loop, so why are we going to promote the Saturn now? Motherfucker, you don't even have to promote the Saturn in your store. You don't even have to have any billboards or kiosks or whatever. Just sell the system. It's there. Don't you want to make money? It's just like so ridiculous. Working in these toy stores at the time, it must have been really stressful for the owners and the people who were the cashiers and people that stocked the stores, because that was the golden era of toys, right, in the 90s. They must have been so stressed and annoyed of all these demands. They probably ran out of stock of toys all the time, and so they decided to play hardball and be a bunch of dickheads to all the video game companies, and they probably said shit to them, you know, like the stuff we heard about, where they were like, oh, well, you wanna sell the system? Well, you better have hundreds and thousands and millions in stock in your warehouse. You better do it, motherfucker, or you're not selling your system here. Because we don't want to deal with all the phone calls from all these customers, from all these parents, from all these kids demanding toys in your video games. We don't want to deal with it and tell them they have to wait a week or a couple of days for these new games and new consoles to come in. Motherfucker, that's what you're supposed to do when you own a toy store, when you own any business. You're nice to the customers and you tell the customers, hey, wait a few days, we'll have them in. Make phone calls, be nice. That's how businesses stay afloat. That's how they survive. Look at fucking PC Richards & Son. Their slogan, every time you go into a PC Richards & Son, what is their shit? You see it everywhere. Nice to the customer. Customer guarantee. They're good at doing business. That's why they're still around. Circuit City, Toys R Us, KB Toys, all that shit. It was all these assholes that screwed over Sega and Atari. So now we know the truth. This needs to be known for video game history, because you guys gotta remember, man. This is before GameStop, you know, before the 2000s. There was not an established game store where gamers could go to get every console and every new game that was coming out. There weren't exclusive stores that just sold game systems back in the day. There was Funkoland, there was Toys R Us, there was KB Toys, shit like that, okay? Where you go into the store and it sells lots of things, and you have the one section over there for the game consoles, right? You guys remember how it was? It's not right. It's not fair that this is what happened. Because if these stores didn't act this way, the Sega Saturn would have sold more, and the Sega Saturn still would have been in third place, I think, to the PS1 and the N64. It still would have sold way more. And the same thing with Atari. It would have sold way more. Plus, Atari needed to fix the IBM problem and their bugs, but even still, the Jag would have sold more because it would have been in the stores. Very frustrating. You know, I think remember back in the 90s, there was competition with the toys. Oh, this toy's coming out versus this toy. So they were probably annoyed by all the competition of the toys that were coming out. Warner Brothers was coming out with a toy. Power Rangers versus Ninja Turtles with the toys, or all that shit. They were probably annoyed by that competition with the toys, right? And then you put video games on top of it with the kids and everything, and they're like, oh, I don't want to deal with that. I don't want to fucking deal with that. We already dealt with that shit with the toys. We're not dealing with that with the games, so you companies that sell game consoles, you have different rules. We have more demands for you. No, motherfucker, like, you guys ruined it. You guys ruined Sega and Atari. Two great game companies that had great motherfucking game consoles that people still play to this very day, and it's all your fucking fault. It's your motherfucking fault, for the most part, that these consoles didn't get to be known more in the marketplace. They weren't there as much. You had to hunt down to find them. You were lucky enough to find a random ad in a magazine when they had enough money to print it, to see, oh, the Atari Jaguar is over here. The Sega Saturn's over here. Oh, but you went to every Toys R Us in America back in the day, and they all had PS1 and N64. Yeah, not right. Horse shit. All right, enough. I said enough. My name is SuperPat98. Thank you for watching.